So, Fidel Castro passed on Friday night, and I wanted you today to talk about some stuff we don't maybe know. Some of the stuff that's not going to be on CNN. And if you could finish the show out with that, I'd like that.
I'll try. I'll
Okay.
try. So the usual coverage, right? The usual media line on somebody like Fidel Castro is on the one side, you have people saying he's the devil, he's a monster, he's a killer, he's a brutal dictator. And then they go out and engage in what I think is, in some ways, in very bad taste, right? They go out there and dance in the streets and hosannas. The guy is dead. He was widely hated, that's for sure. And my opinion on him is mixed. The other side of it is the kind of left liberal mushhead view, which looks at him in a kind of a cloud of sentimentality, and that he was a real hero and he was a real revolutionary. And of course, with Che Guevara at his side up until 1968 or so, they were the ones who were fighting imperialism. And I'm afraid that version will probably not hold very much water. So what I would like to do is to consider Castro, first of all, as certainly someone who benefited from the destabilization of the Batista regime in Cuba, a destabilization which was done by the United States. Now, let me just remind you about who some of these people were. Before the time of Castro, we had the dictatorship of General Fulgencio Batista, who actually had been in power twice in Cuba. He was the one-man authoritarian ruler, dictator, I guess you'd say, from about 1940 to 1944. And then he was back in power from 1952 to the morning of New Year's Day, 1959. And of course, everybody out there has seen that famous scene in The Godfather, right, where Batista's giving this great reception in his presidential palace, New Year's Eve, 1958, and he comes out and says to these people, "Look, the rebels, the revolutionaries are approaching the city, and I've got to get out of here, and I recommend that you do that too, right?" And then the two brothers, right, Fredo and the other guy, right, they flee. Well, Fredo goes off on his own, but that's the scene, right? And that actually happened. That there was a moment where they said we have to interrupt our New Year's Eve celebration to get out of town. So Fulgencio Batista was in power up until this fateful turn from 1958 to 1959, okay? And he was a general and so forth, and this was a dictatorship. However, what you have to bear in mind is the first time that Batista was in power, he actually had positive features. Now, this is 1940 to 1944. I have to parenthetically say, I'm amazed when people write about Castro, they don't write about the Latin American leader, radical reformer, military guy, to some extent a demagogue, if you want, who really was the most prominent between 1940 and 1944. And in my book, that would be Juan Perón of Argentina. They don't seem to mention that. And when you look at the way that Fidel Castro has crowded out Perón of Argentina, I think in some ways you begin to get the idea the U.S. was happier to see Perón crowded out by Castro rather than allow him to dominate. Because I think the so-called justicialismo movement of Perón was probably more dangerous to the U.S. interests in Latin America. Now, that's just a guess, and we'll see. I think we have some pretty solid stuff on this. So when Batista was in power during World War II, and Perón was the dominant guy in Argentina. There were all kinds of things, right? There was like Cuba under Batista was willing to declare war on Germany. That wasn't so hard, but to declare war on Italy for these people, this was hard. Argentina waited a very, very long time, almost until the end of the war, to do that. But the part that pertains to my argument right now is that trade unions played a big part in Batista the first time around, right, in the 1940s. So he had labor legislation, and he had social reforms, economic regulations, promoted the unions, so much so that the communists, right, the old Cuban Communist Party, supported Batista in the 1940s. All right, so then he was ousted. We don't need the details. Then he came back in the 1950s, right, from 52 to 59. And there he seems to have lost his progressive aspect. However, you got to remember the way the CIA operates. They have this restless tendency to oust the ruler of today and bring in the ruler of tomorrow, right? It's what we saw in the Arab Spring. That was a massive exercise, an orgy of that stuff, where you take people like Mubarak and Gaddafi even, and they're willing to work with you. They're happy to work with you, but you want to oust them anyway if you're the CIA. And this is, I think, what happened with Cuba. So let's just look at it. The destabilization of Batista by the U.S. government, it strikes me, is pretty obvious if you look at what was going on at the end of the 1950s. Castro had gone into the mountains of Oriente province, right, the eastern part of Cuba, and in particular this mountain chain called the Sierra Maestra. And Fidel and Che Guevara and Raul, they were all there, and they were, waging guerrilla war against Batista. So in the middle of that guerrilla war, the United States in 1958, as Castro is gathering some momentum, the United States imposes an arms embargo on Batista. The United States says, we're cutting off all arms to the current dictator of Cuba, who was supposedly their guy, their puppet, you might say. All right, so that is very bad, and people know what this kind of a thing will do. If you want to know why Mao Zedong and the communists defeated Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War, you have to go back to the mission of this unfortunate General Marshall, right? The same guy as the Marshall Plan. He was sent to China in 1947, approximately, and that's what he did. He imposed an arms embargo, not on Mao, but on Chiang Kai-shek. And in that sense, he virtually guaranteed that China would fall under communist rule. And this part of this was the fact that the imperialists, for various reasons, hated Chiang Kai-shek. So somehow they seemed to have conceived a great hatred towards Batista, and they wanted to replace him. Right? In other words, the idea was get rid of the old militarized dictatorships in Latin America and try to replace them with so-called reform regimes that might defend U.S. interests better. That was what these guys were thinking. Of course, they are harebrained schemers, right? Don't argue against this hypothesis just because it didn't turn out that way. Now, publicity for Fidel, the myth, as we know. So the myth in Fidel land goes like this. In late 1956 and early 1957, just when Castro is starting up there in that Oriente province, the New York Times sends in a correspondent. He is a correspondent and editorial writer, Herbert L. Matthews, and he arranged to interview Castro. He disguised himself as a wealthy American planter and was taken in to meet Fidel, and he wrote a glowing article of hype, a puff piece for Fidel. I'll give you a couple of samples. He says, this is now the New York Times, Herbert Matthews, quote, "This was quite a man, a powerful 6-footer, olive-skinned, full-faced, with a straggly beard. The personality of the man is overpowering. Here was an educated, dedicated fanatic, a man of ideals, of courage, and of remarkable qualities of leadership." And what do you think he's going to do, Herb? "He has strong ideas of liberty, democracy, social justice, and the need to restore the Constitution, to hold elections." And then he asks him, what do you think of the U.S.? And Castro tells him, "You can be sure we have no animosity towards the United States or the American people," says Fidel Castro to Herbert Matthews of the New York Times. Now, having been part of various kinds of protest movements and so forth, that's not what you get from the New York Times if they don't like you. This indicates that they seem to have liked Castro pretty much. And this kind of coverage was then imitated by CBS News, the leading U.S. network, and by Paris Match, the French weekly magazine with lots of pictures. And from there, it sort of became a fad in the Western press to say, who's that guy with that beard and that cigar and those army fatigues? So we have these two unmistakable steps. We have the imposition of an arms embargo on the United States, by the United States, on the Batista regime in Cuba, 1958, in the middle of his attempt to defend himself against the Fidelistas in the eastern mountains of Cuba. That's, by the way, that's where Fidel came from, right, from Oriente province. And then we have this publicity campaign of the New York Times and CBS News, right, the establishment media par excellence, hyping this romantic figure. And again, the beard, the cigar, the fatigues and all that, right? How romantic, right? It's like creating a whole new image. And then we have the fateful moment on December 11th, 1958, and we're under Eisenhower, right? The Eisenhower administration. And I think by now we may have left John Foster Dulles behind and gone over to Christian Herter, Herter, as the Secretary of State. But in any case, they send the U.S. ambassador, Earl Smith, to tell Batista the United States is no longer going to support you, and citing, atrocities, human rights, things like this. It was by this time Castro controlled a significant part of the eastern end of the island, right, of Cuba. So imagine this: the U.S. ambassador tells Batista, "We don't want you anymore. You have to go. We're not going to support you anymore. No more U.S. backing." So Fulgencio Batista meekly asks, "Well, I have a house in Daytona Beach, Florida. Can I go there?" And the U.S. ambassador Earl Smith says, "No, you can't go there. You should try Spain or Portugal." That is to say, the two fascist governments, Francisco Franco of Spain or Portugal, that would be Salazar, right? So these are very similar. And eventually, that is where Batista ended up. He ended up in Portugal, I believe. So from December 11th, when this ultimatum essentially is given, it's 20 days to December 31st when Batista decides that he has to flee and load all of his money into an airplane. I think he had 2 planes, and he got some of his officials out and some others, and that was it. And then Fidel and his forces entered the city. All right. I think you have to see that this is not a disinterested process. In other words, there is a great deal of pressure being exerted by the United States to overthrow Batista, and there's also a media campaign to hype Fidel Castro. So it's a destabilization. I don't think there's any doubt about that at that point, right? At that point. And you look at this paraphernalia, right? You look at these beards and the cigars and the fatigues, and you wonder, doesn't that look a little bit like the accoutrement of a color revolution a little bit later on, when we have bulldozers or oranges or roses or cedars or other things, right? And also, other kinds of stuff, branding methods that people use to try to establish a social identity. I think so. I think there is a definite element to that. Now, in order to back this up, and we do want to do a review of Castro's policies, obviously, because some of those are very good. But still, here's something that people are not likely to know, which I happen to know because of pure geographical coincidence, I guess we can say. So Fidel married into a wealthy Cuban family. Fidel was somebody who was the son of a new money landlord in these sugarcane fields of eastern Cuba, and he was by the time he was getting out of graduate school, I guess he had a law degree. He married a woman called Mirta Francisca de la Caridad Diaz Balart y Gutierrez. And the key part of that is the Diaz Balart. This Mirta Diaz Balart, let's call her that for simplicity, is the daughter of a very famous politician, Rafael Diaz Balart. And you've heard this name in many cases, people have here anyway, because we've had two congressmen, Diaz Balart. We had Lincoln Diaz Balart. I don't know if he's in office anymore, but we've got another Diaz Balart who is in office. And when he came on, when they asked him about the death of Castro, he said, well, of course, he was married to my aunt. The U.S. congressman is the nephew of Fidel Castro, as he said. And you've also got that guy on MSNBC, right? Jose Diaz Balart. So the Diaz Balarts, I guess, along with the Ross Lightenens, are the two families who are very prominent among the Cuban exile community in Miami. And so look at this interesting thing. The great communist revolutionary Castro is married to a woman who is absolutely a member of the Cuban elite. Now, they get married in October 1948, and they have one son, and this is the son that I would like to focus on, Fidel Angel Castro Diaz Balart, okay? Fidel Angel Castro Diaz Balart. You know, the Spanish method is the mother's name is added, the mother's family name is added at the end, right? So Castro is his father's last name, and the Diaz Balart is this little boy's mother's family name. So this is known as Fidelito, okay? If I say Fidelito, this is who I mean. Now, Castro was all over the place. He was in Cuba. Then he was arrested. He got out finally and got to Mexico. And by about 1955 or 1956, he was preparing to launch his 26th of July movement, right, to attack the island, right, to attack the Batista forces. And this was when he used the famous yacht Granma, right, which is now the newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party, I guess they still call themselves. So Fidelito, what's with Fidelito? So Mirta moved to the United States, but at a certain point, about 1956 or so, Fidel said, "Oh, Mirta, I'm here in Mexico. Why don't you send the boy down here and he can spend a couple of weeks with me?" And then when she did send Fidelito to Mexico to spend some time with Fidel, the son was not allowed to return. Castro he wanted to keep the boy with him. So what happened then was, and now I'm quoting here from the London Daily Telegraph. This is about, it's an article about the struggles in the Castro family. So eldest son, Fidelito, is the only officially recognized child, because Castro had quite a few others, outside of marriages, right? Illegitimate children, I guess you'd say. But what it was then was this struggle, the struggle between the two, between Mirta and Fidel, who's going to decide the future of this boy. So here's what we read in the Daily Telegraph. Fidel's first wife, Mirta Diaz-Balart, divorced him in the mid-50s and took Fidelito, born in 1949, as the oldest of at least 9 children Castro fathered. The others were all outside of marriage. Took him to the United States. Castro wanted the 5-year-old not to fall under the influence of the Diaz-Balart family. And while in Mexico, preparing for the guerrilla war, again, it's about 1956, Castro persuaded Mirta to send Fidelito for a 2-week visit and then refused to send him back. Later, as Castro's sisters were taking the boy for a stroll in Mexico City's Chapultepec Park, 3 armed men jumped out of a car and grabbed the boy and took him back to his mother, I think at this point already in the U.S. Now, here comes the part that I know about. Where did Mirta Diaz-Balart end up? Well, she ended up in Flushing, Queens. And indeed, not very far from where I was living at the time. And when Fidelito got there, right, as a result of this snatch and grab operation, they put him in a school in Queens, and it was the same school that I had attended, Public School 20 of Queens, PS 20 Queens, the John Bown School, because it's located near the Bown House and other interesting things. So for a couple of years, he attended this school. I myself was there from 55 to 56 and 56 to 57. And I think there might have been a time when I was attending the same school, right? If we look at this this interesting chronology that I've just tried to give you. So this is part of the lore of the neighborhood of Flushing, Queens, and of North Flushing, Queens, I guess. And in particular, this public PS 20. Now, there is an account in the internet where it is alleged that at a certain point, probably in 1959 or 1960, Raul Castro was sent to the school, to PS 20, to get Fidelito and bring him back to Fidel. But I think Fidel at that point was across town. Fidel was in Manhattan at the UN or the Hotel Teresa or something like this. So what there was then at PS 20, there was a special assembly where Cuban military guys, right, the Cuban guerrillas in their green khakis with the beards and the cigars, came into the school and attended the assembly and took part. And there was a kind of a consignment of Fidelito to them. This must have been in say, April or May 1959, because this was when Castro came to the United States on a goodwill tour. Right, he was the new prime minister of Cuba. Where did he go? Moscow? No. Beijing? No. Algiers? No. None of that. Cairo? No. He came to Flushing, Queens, to get his son. And notice that the U.S. authorities didn't do anything to prevent that. In other words, they said, fine, you want your son, you take him. What that indicates to me now in retrospect, right, many, many years later, is that the U.S. authorities were on the whole rather friendly to Fidel Castro, especially when he came on that first visit, April 1959, right, just a couple of months. I think he became prime minister officially in February. So my view of Castro has always been that he was a kind of a U.S. asset, and that he was a kind of a new look for a new way of running things, right, that went together with the Kennedy presidency, and that at this point, he was not a communist. He was welcomed. I think he was welcomed by the National Press Club I can remember watching him on television, I think in 1959, when he was giving interviews in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Harvard, and they put one of his speeches on TV. So they seem to have been hyping him. So on the whole, what we have up until, I don't know, the end of 1959 and the beginning of 1960 is somebody who seems to be, on the whole, patronized by the United States. Not what you think. Somebody who could not have gotten that far without help from the hated imperialists. So how did this get to a parting of the ways? Well, now we have to talk about some of the really good things that Castro did, right? Because it did not stay the same. He obviously did not remain as a U.S. asset or project up until the end, right? That honeymoon didn't last very long. So the first thing is I guess it's in the spring of 1960, Fidel carries out a land reform. And a land reform is one of the greatest things in terms of modernizing a country. It is absolutely critical. You can call it an agrarian reform if you want to. This is one of his promises. So, yeah, already earlier than I thought. May 1959, Castro approves the first agrarian reform. Now, the curse of Cuba is the latifundia, right? The latifundia, the large landed estates. And in Cuba, it's primarily sugar cane, still is, and tobacco and a few other things. But the problem is that the land is owned by absentee landlords who are maybe in Havana or they may be in, Wall Street. And these poor guys on the farm, right, the tenant farmers or sharecroppers, they get a very, very bad deal. And this is the key to social backwardness. So this is, I think, one of the best things that Castro did. He said, look, we're gonna place an upper limit of 1,000 acres on every owner. Now that's already pretty high, right? An American family farm traditionally is, 300, 400 acres, sometimes as little as 250 acres. But in this case, 993 acres or 40 hectares per owner, and no foreigner can own land in Cuba, another really good thing. So the result of this is that 200,000 peasants get deeds to land as these large holdings were broken up. So in effect, the latifundists are expropriated, and these peasants and sharecroppers and so forth, they get the blessing of land, right? Which is what every peasant hungers for. I would suggest that one in particular, the 200,000 peasants, probably an extended family around them, right? Probably gets you up, it's probably about 10 people on each one of them. So you're up to 2 million right away. And I think the population of Cuba is 11 million? So that's already a very, very large, hardcore of people. And those guys, I'm sure some of them are wondering tonight, if the communist regime falls and we get the wonders of democracy, will the new regime try to take those holdings away and restore the latifundists? Because there were some measures like that in East Germany, say, when the communist regime ended there, right? Expropriated land was then, restored in some cases, not all, limited, but it did happen to people who had owned it, pre-1945. After the land reform, the two other things that are really excellent are the education policies and the healthcare policies. So the land reform creates this class of peasant smallholders, sugarcane land, and then the education and the health, right? So education it gets to be school for everybody. They can also offer you half work, half school if you're destitute, so that you can put yourself through school, various kinds of better opportunities. You can always go and study in Moscow or East Germany or things like this. And subsidies. So the subsidies apply especially to food, to milk, to eggs, to things like this. There have been some very, very rough phases in the Cuban economy. One in particular was between 1990 and 2000. That was after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev, I'm afraid, rather abruptly, cut off the aid to Cuba, right? Because they were getting oil, in particular from the Soviets, and manufactured goods in exchange for sugar, and of course it was a political gesture. So between 1990 and 2000, things were bad, really, practically starvation, although not starvation, right? They were able to stop short of it because they have this social safety net. So in 2000, along comes Chavez of Venezuela and says, I'll give you an even better deal, right? Send me some doctors and I'll send you more oil at better terms than the Soviets ever did. So that's important. Now, just to get to the split with the U.S., when Cuba had done the land reform, the U.S. was then already breaking diplomatic relations, refusing to buy any more sugar cane. So they desperately needed a customer. The Soviets were there. The Cubans, by the way, always looked at China as someplace that was probably ideologically closer to them, but they didn't want that because China had nothing to offer. China had no oil, no material support the way that the Soviets did. So when the Soviets offered crude oil, the Cubans said, okay, we have refineries here. The refineries belong to Standard Oil and to Shell and other U.S. oil companies, right? The Seven Sisters, as they were known. The U.S. refineries said, we will not process Soviet oil. And at that point, Castro expropriated them. And that really was the breaking point. It was after that that the diplomatic relations and so forth began to go. Then, look, the ups and downs of the Cuban economy. Because if you look at it, there has been significant infrastructure built, but I think it's infrastructure of a fairly rudimentary type. In other words, the bridges, the roads, and a few things like this. There have been efforts in that direction. And again, maybe we do a little bit more on the economy in a day or two. Let me just talk to you about Fidel's immediate family, though. What you find is that you go online, and it is thought that his sister Juanita is someone who, she has been a tremendous opponent of her brother, and the question then was always raised, is she working for a force which is hostile to Cuba? And then his other people in his family also seem to have found their way into the ranks of the U.S. services. So the question then is, where does all of that add up? The point, though, is the political break was reached when the U.S. broke diplomatic relations, and then, of course, with the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961, which was for sure a CIA attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, which he was able to defeat. During that initial honeymoon phase, Castro was calling for a Marshall Plan funded by the U.S. of $30 billion for the development of Latin America as a whole and Cuba in particular. And this would have been serious. And this is actually quite similar to what Kennedy was proposing, right? The so-called Alliance for Progress. Back in the day when the U.S. had some kind of a positive economic proposal to be made to other countries, right, which is now hardly the case. It was the Alliance for Progress was about the same thing, $30 billion, $40 billion over a period of years, build infrastructure and related things in Latin America. Castro, in effect, was taking the U.S. line to an international conference in those early months of 1959. So again, this was not pre-programmed to be a clash. It was programmed to a clash by the stupidity, for example, of Richard Nixon. Right when Castro came to the U.S. in 1959 for the first time as prime minister and said, "I'd like to meet somebody in the government," they gave him Nixon. So they gave him probably the least sympathetic, right, the least able to comprehend anything about the third world. So that was when the divergence began. In the recent years, Castro had diverticulitis, right, starting in 2006. So he gradually dropped out of his functions, leaving Raul. And I guess what we ought to talk about tomorrow probably is what's going to happen next, because as it is, Fidel is now gone. You've got Raul, who says he will quit the government in 2018, I guess it is, 2 years from now. Raul is also in advanced age, right? He's 85 years old. Fidel was 90. What's going to happen? And will there be an attempt at a color revolution by the U.S.? Will there be a counter attempt by others? This we cannot know. Another couple of things to be said about Castro is his, they call it pragmatism, but some would say he was really willing to throw anything overboard in the last years to hang on to power. One would be dollarization. There was a period from the mid-90s to the mid-aughties when the Cuban economy functioned primarily on dollars and not at all with the Cuban peso. There was a period of central planning which went on for quite a while, starting in the beginning in the early 60s, but by 2010, the central planning apparatus was on the way out, right? It was being dismantled. So again, land reform, education, healthcare, but at the same time, there is a lack of large infrastructure. And of course, the immediate answer from the Cuban sympathizers is, how could we do it when we were under the embargo of the U.S.? And that is an argument which is quite persuasive, right? In other words, a lot of the poverty and difficulty comes from the embargo, but not all of it. I advance this hypothesis, which I think is a solid one, that Fulgencio Batista, the pre-Castro dictator in Cuba, was deliberately destabilized by the U.S., by the CIA, by the State Department. Proofs of that, I think, are pretty clear. One, during 1958, an arms embargo was imposed on Batista as he was fighting a civil war against Castro and his guerrillas in the eastern Oriente province, the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Then we have this tremendous propaganda offensive led by the New York Times, CBS News, Paris Match, and other similar publications to glamorize the image of Compañero Fidel and these guys with cigars and beards and fatigue caps in the mountains, right? The typical Latin American guerrilla. And again, to me, this is already, the smell is that of a color revolution, right? These are the gimmicks, right? The posturing that always goes into these color revolution scenes. And then the bad media, of course, for Batista, because he was an oppressor. And he was an oppressor. There's no doubt about that. Then there's also this question about any number of other things, right? These question marks, things like, why did Castro bring in the U.S. dollar from 94 to 04? Is that really that revolutionary? I always have to say, the old Latin American Labor Committee, which I observed closely and I was always very interested in, and went to Latin America with them a couple of times, they always found themselves in a relation of, what can we say, clash with Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro the Cubans under him were sectarian, and there were a lot of things that were necessary that they thought were too radical. And in particular, what I recall is this question of comprehensive moratorium on the financial debt of the Latin American countries. And this became an issue in 82, 83. We had people writing about the debt bomb in the London Economist. We had people writing about, well, the Mexican president, Lopez Portillo, who went ahead and did a whole bunch of powerful unilateral measures that were more radical than what Castro did. Of course, Castro didn't have a big economy like Mexico to work with. So there's always a question with him. And then we come down to this thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this was October 1962. People have to remember this is the closest brush that the entire world had with thermonuclear war. And it came because Nikita Khrushchev had been partially defeated. Khrushchev, of course, the Soviet party boss, the premier of the Soviet Union. There was a Berlin crisis from August until especially October 1961. August was when the beginnings of the Berlin Wall went up. And then in October, we had the famous confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie. And the confrontation around Checkpoint Charlie was you had the standoff of the Soviet tanks and the U.S. tanks with a demarcation line in the middle. But as this went on, the U.S. went to higher levels of nuclear alert, and the Russians actually had to sort of back down to get out of this situation because the Russians were in a position where a U.S. second strike would have been larger than a Soviet first strike. In other words, the Soviets could have shot all of their liquid-fueled nuclear weapons at the U.S., and they would have gotten back a second strike after those had hit, a second strike that would have been bigger than what the Soviets had thrown at the U.S. There was no bomber gap, there was no missile gap. In particular, the U.S. had very considerable superiority. So the question was then, what are you going to do? Soviets, are you going to have a buildup of your nuclear missile forces over years, maybe a decade, and get to parity or some kind of superiority? Or are you going to do some trick, right? Cut some corner and try to solve it? So Khrushchev, right, when Khrushchev was fired in 1964 by the Politburo, they accused him of harebrained scheming. So Khrushchev said, look, rather than wait and have to, cool it, and I'll probably be gone soon, right, because he was getting older, he said, let's find a magic solution to this. I'm going to put my Soviet made and controlled medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles into Cuba. Let's put them in. Let's tell the U.S. we won't, and they had told the U.S. many times, we'll never do that, and they did it. So they put these missiles in there, and quite predictably, the U.S. went then into a confrontation mode, right, with Kennedy making that very dramatic speech at the beginning of the crisis in late October 1962. And then we had the situation of a naval blockade imposed by the U.S. to prevent more missiles from coming in, but that didn't stop the existing missiles from being readied and essentially made operational. It was clear that those Soviet forces in Cuba had tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, which they were going to use if the U.S. had invaded the island. So then we would have had nuclear war. We would have had World War III. We had other incidents where with the quarantine blockade, there was a Soviet submarine with nuclear torpedoes that was about to fire them at one point until they got communications from Khrushchev that they shouldn't do it. So we can't go through all of this, but here's what I would like to do. This is the infamous letter from Fidel Castro to Nikita Khruschev, the Soviet party boss prime minister, dated October 22nd, 1962, where Fidel Castro writes, "Dear Comrade Khrushchev," and he goes through the analysis. He says, according to us, the situation and the reports which have reached us, we, the Cuban leadership, think that an attack is almost imminent within the next 24 to 72 hours. There are two possible variations. The first and most probable one is a U.S. air attack on certain objectives with the limited aim of destroying them. Well, certainly to destroy all of those Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles. Those would have been targeted, sure. And the second, though this is less probable, it's possible that there will be a full invasion. This is the same package. In other words, the air raids and the full invasion would go together. This would require a large force therefore it might not happen. Those are the two possibilities, according to Fidel. He says, if, this again, Castro to Khrushchev, if the second variation, the total invasion, takes place, and the imperialists, the U.S., invade Cuba with the aim of occupying it, the dangers of their aggressive policy are so great that after such an invasion, the Soviet Union must never allow circumstances in which the imperialists could carry out a nuclear first strike against the Soviets. Now, I don't know if it's clear what he's just said, right? In other words, if you're not willing to let the other side carry out a first strike, that means that you have to carry out a first strike. And that is the interpretation always given to this particular letter, that what Castro is saying to the Soviet leader is, I, Castro, want you, Khrushchev, to carry out a first strike, a nuclear first strike, preemptive surprise attack on the United States if they seem to be starting to invade Cuba. I tell you this because I believe that the imperialists are extremely aggressive, extremely dangerous, and if they carry out an invasion of Cuba, that would be the moment for us to eliminate them as a danger forever in an act of the most legitimate self-defense. However harsh and terrible the solution, there would be no other. So that's Castro proposing to incinerate the United States with those big, dirty Soviet bombs. Now, much to his credit, the Soviet leadership was not interested in this. Khrushchev was horrified. This was not what they wanted. The point of putting the missiles in there was not to use that as a stepping stone to a surprise attack on the U.S. It was to deter. It was to say, look, you have the upper hand right now, but if we put these medium-range missiles close to you, then those will hit you, and then we're back to parity, and then we can negotiate or something like that. But notice, that's not what Castro has in mind. Castro says, if you dare come after us, we want to blow up the entire world. And I think, for Americans especially, that ought to put him in a somewhat different light, or indeed anybody, because this would have led to the incineration of most of North America, most of Europe, and most of Northern Asia, or Eurasia. That would have been the result. And that would have been a tragedy for world civilization beyond all measure. So I think we would have to say Castro is something like a Maoist. In other words, the old quote from Mao where he says, China has so many people that we can absorb a nuclear war. We will go to the mountaintop and watch the tigers fight. We'll watch the U.S. and the Soviets tear each other to pieces, and then we Chinese will win the day. Castro doesn't have that kind of demography. He doesn't have all those people that he can play around with, but he seems to be thinking in those terms. So I would say this is a moment of Castro that you can't forget. In other words, land reform is a great thing, and I'm for it. On the other hand, these are the words of a monster.